They believe that life may surprise you at any age. I think I always believed there would come a day when I'd have everything figured out, a quiet, simple routine devoid of the concerns and demands of youth. But maybe life isn't like that. Perhaps there are instances that jolt us. These instances may cause us to question our understanding of certain concepts. My name is Eileen, and I am 63 years old. After a career as a school principal and having two outstanding children, I assumed I understood who I was. My spouse went away 5 years ago. Since then, I've established a life of calm routines, morning walks, gardening, and keeping up with family. I thought I had left excitement and spontaneity behind in my youth, but something altered recently in ways I can't quite understand. It began so gently that I hardly noticed a lingering gaze, a quiet moment, a connection that seemed harmless until it wasn't. My son Adam has a buddy named Caleb, who has been close to our family for many years. He was like a son to me, someone I had always trusted and respected. But something changed in the span of one day. There was stillness between us that felt strange, like something unspoken that neither of us knew how to confront. Looking back, it's hard to comprehend how a lifetime of stability and self-assurance could suddenly feel so fragile and vulnerable to doubt, leaving me to ponder what transpired that day and why I'm still contemplating it. This is my tale, but my life, my narrative is not exceptional, yet it is pleasant. I like it that way. After over 30 years as a school administrator, I decided to retire, intending to finally have some peaceful time. My spouse, Neil, passed away 5 years ago. He was a solid, compassionate man, and despite our differences, we loved one another dearly. Losing him was difficult, but I found strength in everyday routines and tight ties with our children, particularly my son Adam. Adam and I have gotten closer after Neil died. Adam, 35, is dependable. Neil and I have always been pleased with Adam's responsible nature. Despite living alone, he frequently visits, and he consistently maintains a sense of ownership. Adam brings warmth and fun into the quiet home with his stories and jokes. Caleb, one of Adam's closest pals, regularly accompanies him. They met in college, and since then, Caleb has been a regular part of our lives. At 37, he's built a successful career in engineering, and his stability and dedication remind me so much of Neil's. Caleb is thoughtful and respectful, with a quiet, contemplative nature that makes people feel comfortable around him. I've always felt very fortunate to see Adam and Caleb remain close over the years. Caleb's presence brings a different energy to the house, a steady calmness that I appreciate. After finishing up some gardening, I decided to reward myself with a cup of tea and a relaxing day at home. Adam was out of town for a meeting, and the house was quiet. Just as I was ready to drop into my chair, I heard a knock on the door. To my amazement, it was Caleb. "Hi, Mrs. Caldwell," he said with his usual pleasant grin. Adam informed me that he would be out of town, but I wanted to drop off some books I had borrowed from him. I said, "Caleb, it's great to see you," genuinely delighted by the unexpected visit. "Come inside. If you're not in a hurry, feel free to stay for tea." He paused, then nodded. "I'd enjoy that. It has been a while." We settled into the living room once I had had a chance to unwind. For the first few minutes, our conversation was light. We talked about work, family, and life in general, but something about the atmosphere felt different. Maybe it was the quietness of the empty house or the relaxed tone of our conversation, but I started to feel an unusual sense of ease around him. As I handed him a cup of tea, our fingers brushed. I didn't think much of it at first, but as we continued talking, I couldn't help but notice that Caleb's gaze lingered on mine. Again, a brief but detectable contact that gave me a little thrill. I looked up, catching his stare, and felt a surge of self-consciousness. "Thank you," I replied. He quickly pulled his hand back, smiling sheepishly, and there was a silent moment of mutual discomfort in which neither of us knew what to say. It was a little gesture, simply a hand on mine, and a moment of uncertainty, but something changed in that brief second. I felt warmth, an awareness between us that I hadn't anticipated, a connection that went beyond mere friendliness. I brushed it off as my imagination, convincing myself that it was just a momentary lapse, a result of the stillness of the afternoon. But as we continued chatting, I found myself becoming more aware of his presence, noticing the small things, the way he leaned forward when I spoke, his quiet laughter, the warmth in his gaze. I was left with an odd feeling and awareness of him that hadn't been there before. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but the memory lingered, leaving me with a strange sense of anticipation and confusion. In the days that followed, I couldn't quite forget that afternoon with Caleb, despite my attempts to dismiss it as a simple interaction. The memory of his touch, his gaze, and the quiet intensity in his eyes remained with me. I felt foolish for even thinking about it, for allowing my mind to wander to unfamiliar places. Caleb was like family to Adam, someone I watched grow from a college student to a respected professional. But I couldn't deny the small thrill I'd felt in his presence, the sense of warmth and comfort that had lingered long after he'd left. I found myself wondering if he'd felt it too, or if it was simply my imagination, a passing feeling brought on by loneliness and nostalgia. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Yet the feeling lingered, like an unanswered question at the back of my mind. A week later, Caleb stopped by again, this time to return a book he borrowed. He seemed relaxed, and I invited him to sit for a while. Feeling the same warmth I felt before, we talked easily, like a mother watching her child grow into adulthood. But there was something else to a growing awareness of the way he looked at me, the attentiveness in his gaze, the unspoken connection that felt both natural and unsettling. Our conversations became more personal, and with each meeting, I felt the unspoken tension growing. It was subtle, a quiet understanding that neither of us acknowledged, but both felt. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, simple friendship, but deep down, I knew there was something more, a feeling I hadn't expected and didn't quite know how to handle. Over the next few weeks, Caleb's visits became more frequent, and each time he stopped by, I felt a mix of excitement and guilt. I loved his company and looked forward to our chats, as well as the warmth and understanding he brought into my life. But I was also becoming more uneasy. There was a quiet fear that I was going too far, allowing myself to develop feelings that weren't appropriate for our relationship. One evening, as we sat in the living room discussing an old family photo album, I realized just how much I'd come to enjoy his presence. We laughed over memories and shared stories, and for a moment, I felt a sense of companionship I hadn't felt in years. But as he leaned in to look at a photo, his arm brushed against mine, and I felt my heart race. It was such a small thing, a connection, but the proximity and the warmth of his touch sent a thrill through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked at him, our eyes meeting, and for a brief second, I felt a connection that went beyond friendship, a quiet, unspoken bond that left me both excited and terrified. I knew I had to stop this, to distance myself before things went any further. Yet each time I tried to convince myself to end our meetings, I felt a pang of regret, a longing for the comfort and warmth he brought to my life. I couldn't deny the loneliness I felt since Neil's passing, the quiet ache that had become a part of my everyday existence. Caleb's presence filled that void and brought a sense of companionship and understanding that I hadn't realized I needed. And though I knew my feelings were inappropriate, I couldn't bring myself to let go, to close the door on the one connection that made me feel alive. One evening, with Adam still out of town, Caleb came by to drop off some groceries he'd picked up for me. I invited him to stay for dinner, and we spent the evening cooking together, laughing, sharing stories, and enjoying each other's company. Meeting his gaze as the night wore on, our conversation grew quieter, more reflective. Caleb shared his struggles, his loneliness, and the difficulties he faced in balancing his career with his personal life. I listened, feeling a deep sense of empathy and understanding, a connection that went beyond words. At one point, as I was washing dishes, I felt Caleb's hand on my shoulder. It was a light touch, gentle and reassuring, yet it sent a warmth through me that I couldn't ignore. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and in that moment, I saw the same feelings reflected in his eyes, a quiet longing, a depth of emotion. That moment left me speechless. I do not know, he began, his voice gentle and almost hesitant. How to say this, Mrs. Caldwell? I sense something between us. I'm not sure what it is, but I can't ignore it. My pulse raced, a mixture of astonishment and panic building within me. I wanted to reject it, dismiss it as insignificant, but I knew it would be a lie. I looked at him, observing the vulnerability in his expression, the same uncertainty and longing that I felt. We can't, I replied, my voice barely a whisper. This isn't something we can pursue. To which he nodded, but his hand lingered on my shoulder, a quiet reassurance that spoke of his own confusion. We stood there in silence, both of us grappling with the weight of our emotions and the reality of the boundary we'd silently crossed. After a long moment, he stepped back, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell. I didn't mean to make you feel that way. You didn't. I offered him a small smile, acknowledging the complexity of the situation. We finished dinner in silence, the atmosphere tense but oddly comforting. I knew that whatever had happened between us was real, yet impossible, and though we said little, we both understood that some lines couldn't be crossed, no matter how tempting they might seem. In the weeks following our conversation, Caleb continued to visit, but we approached each encounter with a newfound caution and politeness. We maintained a silent agreement, an unspoken understanding that we would keep our emotions in check, avoiding anything that could be misinterpreted. Our visits, once filled with easygoing laughter and comfortable silences, became carefully orchestrated exchanges, each of us keenly aware of the new boundary we had drawn between us. But as much as we tried, the tension was undeniable. A glance, a subtle gesture, and I felt as though I was holding my breath, waiting for something to shift again. I found myself wishing for the ease we once had, that uncomplicated friendship that now felt lost in the growing complexity between us. One evening, as we sat in the living room discussing a book we both recently read, our eyes meeting in a way that felt both tender and charged, he quickly looked away. But the silence that followed was filled with an unspoken understanding that we were both struggling to maintain our resolve. As much as I tried to remind myself that this was just friendship, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him, a quiet longing that I knew had no place in my life. I thought often about ending these meetings, of distancing myself entirely, but each time the thought crossed my mind, I felt a pang of regret. I had grown attached to these moments, to the warmth and companionship that Caleb brought, and the idea of letting that go filled me with a sense of loss that I hadn't anticipated. In an effort to create some distance, I started to occupy my days with various activities and plans, including joining a local gardening club. I began taking long walks around the neighborhood to prevent my mind from drifting back to those quiet moments with Caleb. However, despite my best efforts, each time he visited, the connection between us remained as strong as ever. One Saturday, we found ourselves alone again, sharing and discussing a topic that had us both laughing. The moment was light, almost carefree, but there was an undercurrent of tension that neither of us could ignore. I saw it in the way his eyes lingered on me and the way his smile softened, as if he too was struggling to keep things light, to ignore the bond that was growing deeper each time we met. The unspoken agreement between us began to feel fragile, as though it could break at any moment. As the weeks passed, I sensed that we were both approaching a critical juncture where we needed to confront the hidden emotions. There were moments when I would catch him looking at me, his expression unreadable, as though he too was questioning where this path was leading us, and each time, I felt a rush of conflicting emotions, a mixture of excitement, fear, and guilt. I knew that the emotions I was experiencing were dangerous, potentially leading to consequences neither of us had yet desired. Despite the risks, I couldn't bring myself to end it and say the words that would draw a final line between us. The tension between us grew with each passing day until our meetings became a delicate balance of restraint and quiet longing we were both holding back. Aware of the boundary that neither of us was willing to cross, yet unable to let go of the connection that had brought us so close. It was a complicated feeling, and I often found myself lying awake at night, wondering how long we could keep up this delicate dance, how long we could ignore the emotions simmering beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew that this couldn't last. We were both playing with fire, and eventually, one of us would have to pull back to make the difficult decision to let go. As much as I dreaded that moment, I knew it was coming, a reality that was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. After several weeks of maintaining this careful balance, I began to feel the weight of guilt more heavily. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying something, betraying Adam's trust, betraying my own values, and perhaps even betraying Caleb in a way. By allowing myself to become emotionally attached, I was indulging in something that had no place in our lives, something that could only lead to hurt and regret. Each time I thought of ending our connection, I felt a pang of sadness, a reluctance to let go of the one bond that had brought warmth and meaning to my days. But I knew I couldn't continue like this. I started reflecting on confronting my feelings, trying to understand what had led me to develop such an attachment. Perhaps it was the loneliness I'd felt since Adam passed, a quiet ache that had settled into my life without my realizing it. Caleb had filled that void, bringing a sense of companionship and understanding that I hadn't known I was missing. But even as I acknowledged this, I understood that my feelings were inappropriate, and that I was risking far too much for a connection that had no future. One evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I decided that it was time to confront my emotions, to understand what I was truly looking for. I realized that while I valued Caleb's presence, it was my own. I realized that my loneliness was a result of my own need for companionship, which had led me down this path. Caleb had simply been the one to fill that void, to provide a sense of comfort in a way that I hadn't expected. Determined to move forward, I resolved to put some distance between us, to create a space that would allow me to let go of the feelings I had developed. It was a painful decision that left me feeling hollow, but I knew it was the right choice. I couldn't continue living with this sense of guilt, this feeling that I was compromising my own values. I needed to find a way to restore my sense of self and heal the loneliness within me, without relying on anyone else to do so. The next day, I planned to speak with Caleb and gently explain that we needed to maintain some distance, to preserve the boundaries of our friendship and to respect the lives we had both built. Even though it was painful, I knew that this was the only way to find peace. And the only way to preserve the integrity of our relationship without crossing a line that would lead to regret. As I prepared for the conversation, I felt a mix of sadness and relief, a sense of closure that allowed me to look at the situation with a clearer mind. I knew this was a necessary step, a decision that would ultimately help me move forward and let go of the feelings that had complicated my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Even though I knew it would take time, I felt a quiet sense of determination, a belief that I could find my way back to the peace and stability I had once known. Our final conversation felt bittersweet, a quiet ending to something that had brought both joy and confusion into my life. When Caleb arrived that evening, I invited him in, feeling the weight of the moment, the sense that this was our goodbye. We sat in the living room, each of us aware of the tension between us and the emotions that had been building over the past few months. I struggled to find the words to express everything I was feeling without hurting him or complicating things further. "Caleb," I began, my voice soft but steady, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about our connection, and I think it's best if we create a bit of space. I've valued our friendship so much, and I don't want to lose that. But I also don't want things to become more complicated." He looked at me, his expression filled with understanding, but also sadness. I understand, Mrs. Caldwell. I never meant to cause any tension or make things difficult. I felt a pang of regret and sadness that I hadn't anticipated. You haven't done anything wrong, Caleb. It's just, I think I let myself become too attached, and I need to take a step back to focus on finding that sense of peace within myself. He softly nodded. For a brief moment, there was a hush between us, a silent acknowledgement that our meetings were coming to an end, marking the conclusion of a chapter that had been both significant and filled with unsaid emotions. I'll miss you, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, and I responded, I'll miss you too. I felt a lump form in my throat, but this is for the best. It's what we both need. We shared a long, silent look at each other, processing the finality of the moment and the realization that this was goodbye. I felt a wave of emotions, relief, sadness, and a quiet gratitude for the connection we had shared, even if it had been brief and complex. As Caleb rose to leave, he gave me a gentle hug, a warm, comforting embrace that felt like a farewell to everything we had shared. When the door closed behind him, I felt a sense of emptiness, a hollow ache that I knew would take time to heal. But I also felt a quiet strength, a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in weeks, confident that we had made the right decision, both taking a step toward preserving our lives, our values, and our integrity. In the days that followed, I found myself reflecting on our bond, on the moments that had brought us close and the emotions that had threatened to pull us apart. I realized that while our connection had been intense, it was also a reminder of the importance of boundaries and the need to protect the relationships that define us. And as I looked toward the future, I felt a quiet determination to find peace within myself, to heal the loneliness that had led me down this path, and to embrace the lessons I had learned along the way.